Hi, this is an introduction to logic. My name is Mark Thorsby, and this course overviews some of the basics of logic, both in terms of categorical, proposition, and predicate logic. But today we're actually going to be taking a look at informal fallacies. And again, we're going to be looking today at really four different types of fallacies, or four different categories of fallacies. Well, in this video we're going to cover 3.1 and 3.2. In the next video we'll cover 3.3 and 3.4. Fallacies in general, as well as fallacies of relevance. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. So today we're going to be taking a look at informal fallacies. Now, first and foremost, what exactly is an informal fallacy? Well, first off, a fallacy literally is a word that's derived from the Latin meaning false. So a fallacy is something that we would say is a false argument. Now, fallacies can be both intentional as well as unintentional, right? So and when we say a false argument, what we mean is that the conclusion does not follow from the premises necessarily. And that's what we mean by a false argument, essentially. Now, there's two types of fallacies possible. There's formal fallacies on the one hand and informal fallacies on the other. Here's an example of a formal fallacy. It actually has a name because it's so common and frequent. It's called affirming the consequent. And here, basically, this is the logical symbolic notation that we're going to cover later on within the logic course here. But here we can see that it basically says that if P then Q, Q therefore P, right? And in this case, because this is known as the antecedent and this is known as the consequent, right? And this is a condition in order for Q to occur. And what this argument is saying that if you make the condition if P then Q and Q happens, then you can conclude P. But that's a false argument. For instance, imagine if the conditional was if it's raining outside, then you're going to get wet. You did get wet, therefore it must be raining outside. That may sound reasonable, but it's actually a false argument because you could have gotten wet by some other means, right? Someone could have sprayed you down with a hose, or if you've ever seen that film Fight Club, right? Someone could spray you. And as a result, right, that means that simply because the consequent has occurred does not necessarily mean the antecedent occurred, right? And so this is a common formal fallacy, affirming the consequent. So let me give you another example here. Denying the antecedent. So this means the same thing, except this is the negation symbol. So this says if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q, right? So imagine if the argument was if it's raining outside, if you go outside while it's raining, then you're going to get wet. If you don't go outside while it's not raining, therefore you will not get wet, right? But you can see for the same reason that argument is also fallacious, because you could get wet by some other means, right? And so what this said, these are arguments where they look true, but their structure is such that they're deficient arguments. And so formal fallacies concern the common mistakes in reasoning and false argument forms that are derived within the structure of the argument itself. Now, regardless of what the terms look like or the particular things that you're analyzing logically or relating in your argument. Now, we're going to be looking at formal fallacies later on in the course when we start doing more formal logic. At this point here, we're looking at informal fallacies. And informal fallacies essentially correlate, though not identically, to the notion of inductive logic or inductive reasoning, which we did cover a couple of videos ago. So let's go back here. So informal fallacies, though, in general, concern the content of the argument. They concern the content. So let me give you sort of an example. And again, these examples come from the Patrick Hurley textbook, just to give a citation and a thanks to Patrick Hurley for his book. But here's the first example. The Brooklyn Bridge is made of atoms. Atoms are invisible, therefore the Brooklyn Bridge is invisible. Now, obviously, if you've ever seen a Brooklyn Bridge, or you just know what a bridge is, you know that it's not invisible. So this is a sort of obviously bad and false argument. Now, but what's going on here? It actually has this structural form, right? Just to sort of give you a sort of sense of how formal and informal fallacies differ. Here's the structure of this argument. It says, if P then Q, if Q then R, therefore if P then R, right? So this says that Um, this is like saying, if Paul goes to the party, then Mary will go. If Mary goes to the party, then Roger will go. Therefore, if Paul goes to the party, then Roger will go to the party. Right? And this is a famous argument. It's actually called a hypothetical syllogism, and it's a valid argument form. So there's nothing wrong with the formal structure of the argument in the case of our Brooklyn Bridge invisibility argument. But it's an unsound argument. It's not true, right? So in order to detect the fallacy, what you have to know is you have to know something about the conceptual content, right? You have to know namely that bridges are large visible objects, and you have to also understand the difference between atomic particles at the infinitesimal level versus normal everyday objects, which are clearly visible, right? So this argument misfires because of the content, right? I mean, we're going to see that and that doesn't mean that we have to be a bit careful, because as we go through these informal fallacies, you're going to see that a lot of the fallacies ultimately operate they operate in the sense that they misdirect our attention in terms of analyzing the inferential link between the premises and the conclusion. And here, remember, every argument has a conclusion, a claim that's trying to be proven, and it has premises or evidence that are meant to support that claim. So when we detect fallacies at the informal level, what we have to do is we have to think about the content of the arguments that are being made, right? And we have to, in terms of the relationship between the evidence or the premises and the conclusion or the claim, right? And so that's what we have to ultimately do, because fallacies operate by misdirecting our attention in terms of how the evidence and the conclusion link up. So, and of course, fallacies that involve mistakes in reasoning are referred to in Latin here as non sequiturs, and all that means is it does not follow. Okay. Now, before we get going here, again, in this video, I'm just going to look at 3.1 and 3.2, but there are 4 different types of fallacies possible. In general, at least we're categorizing them as such, and we're going to be looking at these fallacies today. The first here are the fallacies of relevance. The fallacies of relevance. Now, the fallacies of relevance, or here of irrelevance, share the common characteristic that the arguments in which they occur have premises. Have premises that are logically irrelevant to a conclusion, but may appear psychologically relevant, right? And so the way in which the fallacies of relevance misdirect our attention is by linking the evidence or the conclusion and the the conclusion and the evidence or the premises are not linked logically, but they're linked psychologically in some way. So these are the sorts of fallacies that occur that are psychologically appealing, but don't really make sense. We'll see those in a minute here. There's also fallacies of weak induction. We'll be taking a look at those as well today. And remember, here we're talking specifically about fallacies that occur within inductive reasoning. Right? Remember, inductive reasoning is reasoning by probability. And so fallacies of weak induction are fallacies in which the link between the conclusion and the premises is one in which there's a low probability, or it's a low probability possibility. Now, again, you'd have to know something about the content of the arguments we're talking about. Now, fallacies of weak induction, to give you sort of the specifics here, occur when the link between the premises and the conclusion is too weak. It's pretty straightforward. In our next set of videos here, after this, we'll be looking at the fallacies of presumption, ambiguity, and weak induction, as well as some fallacies of ordinary language. And so there's a whole range of fallacies, and in fact, there's many fallacies. Now, before I get going and talk about the fallacies, I want to emphasize something to you, which is namely this: is that that fallacies occur quite frequently. In fact, there's no shortage of them whatsoever, especially on YouTube. It doesn't take long to look around and begin to recognize that many of the arguments we're confronted with, both on YouTube, but also within our daily life, are fallacious in nature. That is, they sound like good arguments, but they ultimately do not deliver in terms of a logical relationship. So this is really sort of important. And I think that I encourage those of you who watch this video, that as you continue to go through your life and you hear people making arguments, when you catch fallacies, try to become aware of it. And you'll find that many people commit fallacies, and even we ourselves commit them. So that's and think your whole life, everywhere you go, people are trying to convince you. They're vying for your attention, and they're trying to convince you to believe things, how to spend your money, what to believe, what religion to join, etc., etc. And so the question here is, by understanding how the fallacies operate and learning how to spot these different informal fallacies, hopefully you're going to be in a much better position to assess the arguments that people make, so that you can make an informed decision before you're giving consent to something. But anyway, let me jump into it here. That's sort of that's ironically my sort of emotional appeal to you, to take this stuff quite seriously. Anyhow, fallacies. When you get fallacies of relevance, now in order to identify these, you have to be able to distinguish genuine evidence from forms of emotional appeal. Okay, now I'm just going to sort of go through some of the examples here. The first type of fallacy here is the appeal to force, and some of these ones that are very, very common actually have Latin names that were given to them, I believe, in the Middle Ages by logicians. And this is called the appeal to force, or the argumentum ad baculum. My apologies for misspeaking there. Or it means something like appeal to the stick. Now, the appeal to force basically is pretty easy to spot. This one's not difficult. But the appeal to force is essentially when someone says they present a conclusion, and then in their argument for why you should agree with them is essentially an explicit or implicit threat that force will come to you if you don't agree, right? So it occurs whenever an arguer poses a conclusion to another person and tells them implicitly or explicitly that harm is going to come to them if they don't agree. Now, right, this is sort of, if you don't give me a raise within the next month, you may just show up to work and discover that the building is burned down, right? For those of you, that's sort of Office Space reference, I think. But you can see here, this is a fallacy, right? Now, that doesn't mean you would probably still take a person who said this to you very seriously. But you can see here that the idea that you should agree to, the idea that this person should be given a raise because they're going to burn down the office is not a very good argument, right? In the sense that those are irrelevant sort of features in terms of there's no, like think in terms of the truth condition. It may be true that you burned down the building, but that has nothing to do with whether or not you deserve a raise. In fact, it probably means you deserve the opposite, probably be fired, right, or jailed or something. So that's sort of a good example there. Now, these ones are easy to spot, I think, at the appeal to force. The appeal to pity is easy to spot, but we're often, well, maybe not quite as easy to spot as the appeal to force, but the appeal to pity, or the argumentum ad misericordiam, right? The argument by misery, essentially. This occurs when an arguer attempts to support a conclusion by evoking some sort of pity from the reader or the listener. This is sort of a pity argument. And the pity can be directed either to the listener or to a third party. These arguments are more difficult to spot when they're directed towards third parties, especially if they're crouched. They're couched in technical language, for instance. But here's the sort of example that Hurley gives us. Your Honor, I admit that I declared 13 children as dependents on my tax return, even though I have only 2. But if you find me guilty of tax evasion, my reputation will be ruined. I'll probably lose my job. My wife will not be able to have that operation she needs, and my kids will starve. Surely I can't be guilty, right? So this is a sort of example where, in this case, they are, right, the argument here is that this person should be convicted of tax evasion because they're in a bad situation. That's irrelevant, right? And that's exactly what a judge would say as well, right? And here you're basically trying to pull the heartstrings of the judge. Now, I think another example here is to think about how you can watch these sorts of things in television advertisements. So, for instance, if many of you will probably remember that a couple years ago when there was that horrible earthquake in Haiti, in which countless of people died, and it was just totally horrible. But for those of you who are around or were living in the United States at the time, right after that, a huge campaign was created in order to get donations in order to send money to the Red Cross. And I remember seeing these visual images. The television would just sort of, on the commercials, they would just stop and they would just show these images of these people and just crushed to death. It was just absolutely horrendous to look at. And of course it made you feel a lot of emotion. And then right at the end it would pop up a number. It would say text $20 to this number and you can donate that way through your telephone. And many people did it, including myself, right? But you can see here there was an implicit argument within that television commercial, which was namely I think that using a sort of an emotional appeal to argue that we should give money to the Red Cross. Now, and I think we should, and I think the Red Cross is justified in using that sort of commercial. But think of it, if we took that as an explicit argument, the argument would be because of the because of this catastrophe, there is much emotional suffering. And you're now emotionally suffering. Therefore, you should give money to such and such agency. That's not necessarily true, right? It could be the case, and I don't think this, but it could be the case that, for instance, it wasn't the Red Cross, and it was an organization that was stealing money from people or something, right? And so just seeing those pictures and feeling the emotional sort of tenor of the images is not sufficient to argue that one has an obligation to give donations or something like this. So emotional appeals are very frequent. Especially in sort of things such as political advertisements. Another famous argument here is called the appeal to the people, or the argumentum ad populum. This is essentially the popular fallacy, or the fallacy which ultimately advocates the idea that you should agree to a certain conclusion because I'm sorry. The idea here is that you should agree to a specific sort of conclusion, and you should do so because of a certain sort of emotional appeal to social desires like love, esteem, popularity, admiration, etc. Right? This is essentially using essentially a sort of groupthink against you. And there's sort of three major ways in which this fallacy gets used. The number one and the largest way in which it's used is the bandwagon argument. And here's the example. Of course you want to buy Crest toothpaste. 90% of Americans brush with Crest. So that argument says that you should buy Crest toothpaste because everyone else is buying it. But to think about it here, what if it's the case that 90% of Americans have rotting teeth, right? Simply because everyone is using the toothpaste is not sufficient to say that it's it should be the toothpaste that we ought to use, right? So that's the first one, the bandwagon argument. Appeal to vanity is the second form. For instance, the most beautiful women choose L'Oreal, right? So these are arguments. These ones, of course, if you just pop open any fashion magazine, you're going to see the whole thing littered with these sorts of arguments, in which there's an appeal to vanity, where if you want to look beautiful, here's what you need to do, here's what you need to buy, etc., etc., right? Basically, there's reasons given. The reasons are because you want to look beautiful, and the conclusion is therefore you should buy X product. That's not necessarily logical. It's not logical. Anyhow, the appeal to snobbery, and this one's a little less frequent, but here's the example. A Rolls Royce is not for everyone. If you qualify as one of the select few, this distinguished classic may be seen and driven at British Motors by appointment only, please. Right, so that's an example of a sort of appealing to people's sort of, I guess, snobbery is the word. I don't really prefer that word myself, but the appeal to snobbery. Now, but I think most of them, you're going to mainly see this one here. This is the one. It may be some sort of vanity argument, but these are very frequent arguments as well. Okay, let's see here if I can move this up here. Okay, there we go. This argument is called against the person, and this is a very frequent argument. It's very easy to spot, though. It's called the argumentum ad hominem. Usually we just call it the ad hominem fallacy, and it always generally involves two arguers, or at least it involves one person and an interlocutor, and one of the person advances either directly or implicitly a specific argument, and the other person responds by not attacking the argument, but by attacking the person herself, right? So this fallacy is when instead of discussing the issue, you attack the person, or two people attack each other. And I have, there's actually three different types. So let me go through these types and I'll show you an example that I pulled from YouTube here. There's three types of ad hominem. The first is the abusive. And this is sort of when you attack the person in an abusing manner. For instance, you say, before he died, poet Allen Ginsberg argued in favor of legalizing pornography. But Ginsberg's arguments are nothing but trash. Ginsberg was a pot-smoking homosexual and a thoroughgoing advocate of drug culture. I see there's a spelling error here. My apologies. And there was one here as well, so I'm so sorry. But so what's this argument? This argument essentially abuses the character of Allen Ginsberg and argues that since he's such a horrible person, we should reject his arguments. It doesn't make any sense. It's rude. It's I don't know. It's rude on the one hand, but we see these. These are sort of kind of the, kids have arguments, brothers and sisters, and this is sort of what they do to each other. These are parents see these arguments frequently, I think. So the first is the abusive ad hominem. The second, and probably more common, is the circumstantial ad hominem. For instance, of course, President Bush wanted to invade Iraq. Iraq is the world's second largest oil supply, and he's from an oil tycoon family, right? So this argument says that we shouldn't agree with President Bush's reasons for invading Iraq because of who he was historically within his own family, because he's from an oil tycoon family. But just because someone's from an oil tycoon family does not mean that they are necessarily invading because they want more oil, right? That's right. That's just, you're attacking the circumstances of his life. He was born into the family, and he had no choice about what family he was born in. So it is not rational, unless to prove that that's his reasons, right? This is a circumstantial ad hominem. And the final here is what the tu quo fallacy, or the U2 fallacy. And this is the argument where someone essentially calls you out as being a hypocrite, you might say. So for instance, quote, your argument that I should stop stealing candy from the corner store is no good. You told me yourself just a week ago that you too stole candy when you were a kid, right? You can imagine a kid saying this. But of course, this is a sort of, you did it too, so you're a hypocrite if you tell me I can't, sort of argument. And parents everywhere will be gratified to know that this is an informal logical fallacy. Right? It's so common, in fact, that it was given its own name in Latin. It's easier probably for most people just to pronounce as the U2 fallacy. But those are three types. Now, what I want to do next is I want to show you briefly a video clip that I found from YouTube. And I'm playing it from YouTube live right now, so it's posted on the internet. But in this debate, what we have is an example of one of these ad hominem arguments. And this comes from, I think this is the Bill O'Reilly show on Fox News. This is a number of years ago, so this is a while back. But I'm going to skip ahead in the video because it's fairly long, actually. But in the video, what he does is they're discussing about whether or not abortion should be legalized, and Miss Welsh, I believe is her name, who you can see right here, she's arguing that it should be. And anyway, they're discussing abortion. I just want to sort of skip ahead, and you can see what happens here. Let me see if I can find it. About here, maybe.
There are people who think guns should be abolished. I'm not one of them, but let's just take that as an example. We're not going to take that as an example. Now, would it be okay for those people to go crusade against gun dealers and put their pictures up and call them baby killers and say they have blood on their hands and picket their stores? That's illegal. It's a legal right. Many people think should not be. We need to change the laws. We don't need to crusade like a vigilante against someone who performs a legal medical procedure. Absolutely true. Siller was running an abortion mill 42 times, 24 times over a period of 5 years. He was running an abortion mill. Everybody in Kansas knew illegal facility. You don't. He was running a legal. You know who has blood on their hands? You. You don't care about ridiculous stuff. This is ridiculous. You're the zealot. Now you're
Okay, that's enough. We're going to stop right there. She actually is just about to accuse him of having blood on his hands. And you can see this is a great example. It would be humorous if it wasn't so sad that this is actually representative of the public discourse in America. But in this case, we have a case where Bill O'Reilly here, in this case, begins, instead of discussing the issue and attacking her argument, he now is attacking her and saying she has blood on her hands. And then she's going to come around and say the same thing to him. So both of them ultimately commit the logical fallacy of the ad hominem here. And so this is a sort of great example. And unfortunately, there's no shortage of arguments like these. They're entertaining, but you can imagine there may be people who watch these sorts of arguments played out on television and think that these arguments are actually valid, logical arguments, and they're not. This is not a logical discussion at all. And so this is a good example. I also like using this example because it also emphasizes the necessity of, it emphasizes the necessity of studying logic because of the frequency of fallacies. Anyway, if you're taking the course normally, I'd ask you to do a quick write exercise, but if you want to do this on the video, you can do it on your own. The quick write exercise that I'd ask you to do is actually to pause and take a moment, pause the video, take a moment, and see if you can think of a recent fallacy that you yourself were confronted with, or you even made, for instance. See if you can figure out what the argument was that you gave, or the argument you heard was. What was the conclusion? What were the premises? And why were they fallacious? And what was and think about, if you could, fallacies of relevance, right? Because ultimately, in order to learn how to do this appropriately, you have to practice in terms of evaluating lots and lots of arguments. So if you have time, do that. If not, then we'll just keep going. The next major fallacy here is what's called the fallacy of accident. One moment. And the fallacy of accident is committed when a general rule is applied to a specific case in which it wasn't intended to cover. I guess I can't edit it now. A case it was not intended to cover. Typically, the general rule is cited in the premises, then wrongly applied in a specific case mentioned in the conclusion. So this is when you take a general rule and you misapply it, right, in order to derive a specific sort of conclusion. So here's an example. Freedom of speech is a constitutionally guaranteed right. Therefore, John Smith should not be arrested for yelling fire in a crowded theater, right? So in this case, they're taking a general rule, which is that freedom of speech should be respected. It's a constitutional guaranteed right to be allowed to speak freely, but that right doesn't extend to every moment of every day in every place, right? That rule applies only in specific ways. So if you yell fire and cause a panic in a theater, that's illegal, right? And so you're not free to say that, right? So that's a fallacy of accident. Another example here would be property should be returned to its rightful owner. The drunken sailor who's starting a fight with his opponents at the pool table lent you his his .45 caliber pistol, and now he wants it back. You should return it to him right now, right? So there the idea is, a general rule is you should always return property that's lent to you, right? In this case, the drunken sailor who wants to shoot someone is asking for his pistol back. Should you give it to him? Well, you should. No, right? You should not give it to him, right? That's misapplying a general rule. So you can see how a fallacy of accident can be a little bit harder to spot, because ultimately you have to be aware of what you have to be aware of both the intention and the extension of the general rule, right? And that's a sort of reference to a previous video here on intention and extension of terms. Anyway, so that's the fallacy of accident. The next fallacy is the straw man fallacy. And the straw man fallacy is committed when an arguer distorts an opponent's argument for the purpose of more easily attacking and destroying the distorted argument, and concludes that the argument's real argument has been demolished. So the idea here of the straw man is basically a person paints a false picture of what another person is arguing, and then they attack the distortion. And then, because of the distortion, they then say you should reject the real conclusion of the other person's argument. And this is a straw man fallacy. It's essentially you're building up a paper tiger, right? Essentially a false a false perception of the other person's argument, right? And so here's an example. Mr. Goldberg has argued against prayer in the public schools. Obviously, Mr. Goldberg advocates atheism, but atheism is what they used to have in Russia. Atheism leads to the suppression of all religions and the replacement of God by an omnipotent state. Is this what we want for this country? I hardly think so. Clearly, Mr. Goldberg's argument is nonsense. Now, the strawman fallacy, I think, is actually committed quite a bit. But you can see here, why is this argument bad? It's bad because Mr. Goldberg probably doesn't think all of those things in terms of advocating atheism and building an omnipotent state and all this sort of business. He doesn't think that. But they're creating a false picture of what Mr. Goldberg's actual argument against public prayer in the schools is. Okay, so this is a straw man fallacy. And some of you may look at it and think, this kind of looks like an abusive ad hominem, but it's not an abusive, right? It's just a false view, right? So it's a straw man fallacy. The next one here is called missing the point. I can't seem to move my thing, or the ignoratio elenchi fallacy. And this is the missing point fallacy illustrates a special form of irrelevance. And it occurs when the premise of an argument supports one conclusion, but then a different, often vaguely related conclusion is what gets drawn. So here's a case where these ones can be very difficult to spot, but it's the idea is an argument is given, which naturally there's a conclusion, but the conclusion that's given is slightly wrong, right? So it's hard to read here, but for instance, the example here is crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing at an alarming rate lately. The conclusion is obvious. We must reinstate the death penalty. Now, this one is not so subtle, right? But here you can say that cases of theft and robbery have been increasing at an alarming rate. Well, you could conclude or infer from that maybe more attention should be paid to crime, but the conclusion to just say we should reinstate the death penalty from simply one local rise in increase in crime doesn't seem to be inferentially related, right? So this is a sort of good example here. Oops, there we go. That's how we can see it better. Here's another example. Abuse of the welfare system is rampant nowadays. Our only alternative is to abolish the system altogether. Now this one you hear a lot, especially on YouTube. This is sort of kind of people will point out one specific sort of problem and then conclude that basically everything should be abolished or changed. Frequently I'll hear, for instance, someone will say, did you hear what Congressman X did? Well, we should just throw all of the congressmen out of office. You have to ask yourself, well, wait a second, right? There may be one bad congressman, but that doesn't mean that all of them are bad. And so you can see here, this is sort of missing the point fallacy. The next fallacy here is the red herring fallacy. And it's sort of very similar. It's almost its own version. We often refer to it by its own name, the red herring fallacy. And this is the idea of being led astray by a false scent, right? The red herring, it actually comes from the idea of dog hunting, where the dogs could get led astray by a false scent. And so the argument here is when someone gives you an argument the red herring fallacy is committed when the arguer diverts the attention of the reader or the listener by changing the subject to a different but sometimes subtly related one, right? He or she then finishes by drawing a conclusion about a different issue by merely presuming that some conclusion has been established. So the red herring fallacy, it comes in a whole bunch of different variations. I think politicians are particularly well adept at committing the red herring fallacy. Frequently, it's sort of kind of the idea of someone, like this is a sort of example, you'll see a politician and someone say, what do you think about the war in Iraq? Or something of this nature, a controversial sort of issue. And someone will reply by saying, well, I think the war in Iraq means that we've got to have a strong America, and that's why I support education reform. And then they talk about education. They're drawing a conclusion about education that's on the wrong direction, right? It's sort of avoiding questions. And oftentimes people want to avoid arguments, use red herring fallacies. Here's an example. Environmentalists are continually harping about the dangers of nuclear power. Unfortunately, electricity is dangerous no matter where it comes from. Every year, hundreds of people are electrocuted by accident. Since most of these accidents are caused by carelessness, they could be avoided if people would just exercise greater caution. So here, we were talking about nuclear power to start with, and now we're talking about electrocution and helping people out. That's a red herring fallacy. And I think that if you watch the nightly news networks, you'll see that all the politicians, a lot of people commit these fallacies. It's disturbingly frequent, I would say. Another example here is the appeal to unqualified authority. And this is the argumentum ad vocandum. And in this fallacy, essentially, oops, where's the example? I guess I don't have the description written here. But the appeal to unqualified authority, this is essentially when someone gives a conclusion, and the evidence they give is they say, well, because such and so says, right? They cite an authority. Now, when we at the beginning of the course here, we looked at different types of arguments. We noted that there is a one type of argument called an appeal to authority. So, for instance, and that can be a strong argument and a good argument. There's nothing wrong with an appeal to authority argument necessarily, but the problem is whether or not, what if the authority is not qualified? If the authority is not qualified, then they're not an authority, right? And so the appeal to unqualified authority is essentially when people who are not qualified are, or when someone gives an argument, they say you should believe X because such and so says so. Well, who is such and so? Are they qualified to make that sort of determination? This is sort of a silly example here, but David Duke, former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, has stated that Jews are not good Americans. They have no understanding of what American is. And on the basis of Duke's authority, we must conclude that Jews in this country are un-American. Like, wait, what? David Duke, by virtue of him being a Klan member, is not a good authority in terms of being an objective basis to discuss who is and who's an American, who's a good and who's a bad American. In fact, it's fairly ironic because most people would probably conclude that David Duke is the worst American. So this argument is, of course, ludicrous and completely obviously false. But that's an example of unqualified authority. I'll show you here an example of one of my favorites here in a little bit. I think it's quite funny. At the very end here, I'll show you a couple examples. Appeal to ignorance. Now, this is the argumentum ad ignorantiam. Now, this fallacy is when the conclusion, when a conclusion is supported by evidence of ignorance, right? That's basically saying you should believe X because we don't know Y, right? Any argument that uses ignorance as evidence is a bad argument, right? Because you can't conclude from what you don't know what you do know, right? You can only conclude what you don't know that you don't know, right? So here's an example. No one's been able to prove God exists, therefore God does not exist, right? No, that's not a valid argument because here, right, their argument is that God does not exist because there's no proof. But wait a second. No proof just means no proof, right? That's insufficient and ultimately to conclude whether or not God exists. And the inverse argument is also invalid or a fallacy. No one has disproven God's existence, therefore he must exist, right? Here the argument is that since we don't know since we know that we do not have proof, therefore we should conclude something. What? That doesn't make any sense either, right? The general rule of thumb here is that if the premise cites some version of ignorance, you can't conclude what you know, you can't conclude from what is unknown, right? So ignorance is never a good reason. So you see this one actually more frequent than you'd imagine. Another example here is the hasty generalization. It's often referred to here as the converse accident because it's very central rule. Remember, the accident was when you take a general rule and you misapply it, right? The hasty generalization is when you take essentially one example and then you generalize out to an entire class or category of people. For instance, all racial stereotypes function according to the hasty generalization fallacy. So now we should say here that some generalizations are okay, right? It's the hasty generalizations, right? So here's an example here. 10 Arab Muslims hijacked planes and crashed them into the World Trade Center in New York City on September 11, 2001. It's clear that Muslims hate America and resort to violence. That is a completely hasty generalization, right? There are literally millions of Muslims in the world. And so to say that all Muslims hate America because 10 specific people committed this crime, and even more than that, is a hasty generalization, right? So you can sort of say basically all racial and ethnic and national stereotypes essentially function according to this fallacy. So that's a sort of good example. False cause. the false cause fallacy is a fallacy that in which the premise is supposed to function at the evidence is a causal link to the conclusion, but a false cause fallacy is when you're pointing to something that's not really the cause, a false cause, right? So here's an example. During the past 2 months, every time the cheerleaders have worn blue ribbons in their hair, the team has been defeated. Therefore, to prevent defeats in the future, the cheerleaders should get rid of those blue ribbons, right? So basically you can see here there's basically all forms of superstition function according to this sort of argument, where the idea here is that the cheerleaders, if they want to win, they should not have, that somehow the idea that the color ribbon that the cheerleaders wear in their hair is somehow determining the outcome of the games is to point to something that's a false cause, right? The ribbons are not, the color of the ribbons is not causing the game to lose, the team to lose. So this is an example of false cause. Now, in some cases, it's difficult to know about this because if you don't have knowledge of the cause, it's difficult to know if you're committing this fallacy. Okay. Now, a sort of related fallacy is the slippery slope fallacy. And the slippery slope fallacy argues that if one thing happens, that will lead to a chain reaction of events that will lead to some sort of catastrophe. And therefore, you reject any argument that would state you should start with that first thing. Let's see if I can show you a picture here. So, right, for instance, you start with a slippery slope and say, if we do this step, it's going to lead to some sort of disaster through a chain reaction, right? And here's what's difficult is some slippery slopes do occur. That is, there are chain reactions in the world, and so people will make arguments, slippery slope arguments, and sometimes they're good arguments or they're strong arguments. And we say they're strong arguments because it seems probable that chain reaction will occur. But the slippery slope fallacy is when we talk about a sort of chain of events that will occur that's unlikely or improbable. And the way to ask yourself is to ask this question, or remember this rather, is that simply because I can do one thing does not necessitate that I must do another. Such that if someone makes an argument, it's important argument that don't believe this because X, Y, and Z will happen. Ask yourself, or remind yourself rather, that simply because I can do one thing does not necessitate I must do another. So the slippery slope fallacy, here's an example. Attempts to outlaw pornography threaten the basic civil rights and should be summarily abandoned. If pornography is outlawed, censorship of newspapers is only a short step away. After that, there'll be censorship of textbooks, political speeches, and the content of lectures delivered by university professors. Complete mind control by the central government will be the inevitable result. So this argument is a clear slippery slope, and that's saying that that if we outlaw pornography, we're going to end up all the way with the central government mind control. Well, that's just insane. Sorry, I noticed there should be an N, not an M. Right? So that's a good example of a slippery slope. Right? Simply because you do one thing doesn't necessitate a whole bunch of other things will happen. Okay? What I want to do here is I want to show you a couple clips here. Well, no, let me just keep going here. We're running out of time here. The next fallacy is the fallacy of weak analogy. And remember, the fallacy of weak analogy occurs when an analogy is too weak to support a conclusion. So here, a good example here is, well, remind ourselves here that what is an analogy? An analogy is when you basically take two different items that are different, two different relationships, and say that one relationship is similar in some respect to this relationship. Not identical, but similar in function in some way, right? So let's give me examples here. So the pocket watch argument for God's existence is a good example. And so here's the structure of the argument. For those of you who are interested in this, you can read David Hume's analysis of this argument. But the structure, the pocket watch argument for God's existence says basically that if you were walking on a beach and you found a pocket watch, you would look at the watch and you'd recognize that the watch must have a watchmaker because it has a contrivance. It looks like it's been designed. And so the argument here is that the more we study the scientific world, the more we study the world through scientific means, we discover a high degree of complexity and therefore contrivance within the world. If the world has contrivance, just like the pocket watch, there must be a world maker, right? So there is the there's the analogy. So the analogy is you watch to watchmaker to world, so there must be a world maker, right? So this is an analogical argument. Now, and you can see here what essentially happens is some feature from the first relationship is transferred over to the other, right? And here they want to argue, and so the question is this a good argument? And for instance, David Hume argues, well, not really, because if it's an analogical argument, then you have to follow through with the analogy. A pocket watch, is a pocket watch made by just one person? No. A pocket watch is typically made by teams of people, a whole company of people, right? Does that mean that the world is also made by a whole company of people, a team of gods, if you will? No. Anyone who's arguing for the watchmaker argument for God's existence wants to deny that. But if they're denying that, the question is on what basis? Because the analogical argument would seem to support it. So that's sort of an example of how the pocket watch argument commits a sort of fallacy here, right? The fallacy of weak analogy, right? So that's sort of a good example. And so these ones are hard to spot. Basically, when you hear analogical arguments, you have to be clear on what people mean exactly in terms of the relationship structure between the two relations that they're positing together. So what I want to do here is I'll give you two examples of just some of the fallacies we looked at earlier. We won't spend too much time on it, but take a look here. First, there's the Willie Horton. Well, just listen.
Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
So this is a very, very famous political ad, so many of you have seen it probably. But this ad actually really sort of very much hurt Dukakis' chances at winning the presidency in that election cycle. But what fallacy does this argument commit? And here you might want to pause the video and think about it. But the argument, I think the fallacy that it gets committed here ultimately is the straw man fallacy. And why do I argue that? Because I think that ultimately this is presenting a distorted perspective regarding what Dukakis' view on crime really is, right? Because implicitly here is the message that when it says Dukakis on crime, it implies that his policy supports people getting weekend passes and then committing murder. Clearly, Dukakis does not think that, and so this is irrelevant, really, to what his position on crime is. Of course, the tragedy is, a lot of it's a tragedy, but the sad thing here is that regardless of whether or not it was an informal fallacy, that political ad essentially torpedoed a political career. And so you can see the power of fallacies. So let me give you one more example. This is probably my favorite example. Political ads are great, too, for this.
Policy message from Governor Mike Huckabee. My plan to secure the border. 2 words. Chuck Norris. Mike Huckabee's a lifelong hunter who'll protect our Second Amendment rights. There's no chin behind Chuck Norris's beard, only another fist. Mike Huckabee wants to put the IRS out of business. When Chuck Norris does a push-up, he isn't lifting himself up. He's pushing the earth down. Mike's a principled, authentic conservative. Chuck Norris doesn't endorse. He tells America how it's going to be. I'm Mike Huckabee, and I approve this message. So did Chuck. Chuck Norris approved.
Now, I actually think that's a really clever commercial, and I actually rather enjoy it because I find it funny. But ultimately, it's a fallacy, right? Or at least the implicit argument here is that it's a fallacy. What fallacy? Unqualified authority, clearly. Because in terms of who the next president should be, now we could have a debate on who is an authority on who should be the next president. I don't know, but to argue that Chuck Norris, an actor who's paid to say things he doesn't believe himself personally, is not exactly the best authority in terms of arguing why you should believe that Mike Huckabee should be the next president. So this is clearly an example of unqualified authority. But again, these sorts of ads really have a lot of play. And why? Because they ultimately have a certain emotional appeal, right? In this case, this one actually has a sort of comedic emotional appeal. And the comedic emotional appeal creates a sort of positive association with, I guess, Mike Huckabee and Chuck Norris. And therefore, the idea is I should vote for them based upon that. That doesn't make any sense, right? Ultimately, he's not a qualified authority, and therefore it's not a rational relationship. So these are all sort of great examples, and I encourage you to go on YouTube and sort of explore and see if you can find fallacies, and you will, I guarantee you. But I'll tell you this: the more you spot fallacies, and the better you get at it, the less friends you'll probably have, because no one likes being told that their arguments are fallacious. But it's important to know the difference. Okay. Well, that's all we're looking at in terms of informal fallacies for this video. In our next video, we'll handle the next set of fallacies. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys online.